Greetings, everyone. So first of all, please excuse my hair. I know it's kind of all over the place and I probably need to trim it or cut it generally. Today I want to talk about Fatima and kind of where we're at with Fatima at the moment, with what's going on in Ukraine, the great tragedy that's happening with Russia invading Ukraine. It's got a lot of Catholics certainly talking about the Fatima apparition and what Mary said, because she specifically mentioned Russia, and as we can see right now, Russia is doing a lot of evil, and that's not a knock at Russian people in general, but just as Russia, the country. So I want to go through basically what Mary said in the apparition. There's also an article that talks a little bit about, it gives kind of like a timeline of documents that happened. I won't go through the entire article, but I'll just sort of show you the parts that I think are quite interesting. I'll start with the actual apparition itself, and not because there were a lot of things that Mary said. She showed herself to the children of Fatima a number of times and said various things to them. But one of the things that Mary said in relation to Russia was the following. She said, "If my requests are heeded," and this request was basically to consecrate Russia, "Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph, the Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world." I want to focus on that a little bit. Just before I go to that and talk about that, I want to show you this article, because the question is, was Russia consecrated? Now, officially, the official line is yes, it was, in 1984. And in fact, there's an article here that you can see. Here are the resources on the 1984 consecration of Russia, and that there are a number of back and forth letters and things that it goes through. I'll link to the article. You can have a read of that if you want. Interviews with St. Lucia, and then letters that were written to her and her responses. But specifically to the consecration, if I can just find that bit, because it goes through when we thought, or when people thought, that the consecration had been done, and then talks about it not having been done yet. So let's see if I can find those moments. I'm kind of scrolling up and down here. I may have passed it already. I probably should have had it ready before I started talking about it. Or maybe it's further down. We'll see. Probably further down, actually. Because I got to the 1984 part and I thought, well, it must have been above that, but it might be below. Oh, here we go. They mention it here in this, yeah. So it's from a 1989 letter to St. Mary of Bethlehem. This is from Lucia. She signs it at the bottom there. "Received your letter." I think it's "I received your letter. "And although I have very little time at my disposal, I will answer your question, which is the consecration of the world according to the request of Our Lady made?" So she must have been written to and asked, and I think it wasn't the first time she was asked this question. I think. And here's her response. So she says, "In October 1942, His Holiness Pius XII made the consecration. I was asked if it was made as Our Lady requested. I answered no, because it was not made in union with all the bishops of the world." So 1942, first attempt, but it wasn't done properly. Then, in May 1967, His Holiness Paul VI made the consecration. I was asked if it was made as Our Lady requested. I responded no, for the same reason. It was not made in union with all the bishops of the world. And then finally, in May 1982, His Holiness John Paul II made the consecration. Not finally, sorry, but in May 1982. I was asked if it was made. I responded no, it was not made in union with all the bishops of the world. And then finally, in 1984, March, she says she was asked if it was made, and she says yes, now it was made. So it's apparently Lucia confirming that the 1984 consecration was done. Now, there are theories that suggest it wasn't done still, not properly and not with all the bishops, and maybe Lucia thought it was done properly, but it wasn't. But she was asked about it, and she said this time it was done. So officially, we believe that in 1984, the consecration of Russia did take place. But it's an interesting article. I'll put the link under this video, and you can read. There's quite a few documents there that you can go through. Letters back and forth with Saint Lucia. She's a saint now, isn't she? I think. Or is she? Maybe she's not a saint yet. I can't remember. I know that Jacinta and Francisco are saints. Back to what Mary said. Okay, so here's the thing that's tricky. Because it talks about if my requests are heeded. Now, the question is, has the request been done, or has it been done in time? Because she says if it doesn't happen, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world. Now, I think most of us understand her errors to be communism. And I think that's absolutely happened. Not just to the countries that are very obviously communist, but even to some of the others in the West that think they're not, but they've got some strands of communism in them. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Good people have been martyred. The Holy Father having much to suffer, it's difficult to tell because that's ambiguous. Popes have certainly suffered. John Paul II certainly suffered with illness. Whether it means that the Holy Father is going to suffer due to disease or illness, or whether it means it's because of the persecution, I'm not sure. It could mean both. And then here, various nations will be annihilated. Now that's a tricky one because as far as I'm aware, since we've had these apparitions in Fatima over 100 years ago, about 105 years ago now, no nations have been annihilated. Obviously right now we have at the time of making this video, we have a tragic situation in Ukraine where it's being invaded by Russia. I mean, I know this might be upsetting to Ukrainians, but we don't know at the moment if Ukraine is going to remain as Ukraine. And if it did get wiped out and not called Ukraine anymore, then that would be a nation that's annihilated. But I think up until that point, we haven't had any nations annihilated. We've had nations that have split. We've had certainly in Europe nations that became two nations. I mean, Yugoslavia split. We had Serbia and Montenegro that turned into Serbia and Montenegro, and we've had a few situations like that where nations have kind of split into Czechoslovakia turned into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But I'm not sure I would say that's a nation's being annihilated. I can't think of any examples, and maybe you can, and feel free to put it in the comments, where nations have been annihilated since this apparition, or since this was said by Mary. Unless, of course, annihilated could just mean destroyed, that there was much destruction in those nations. It might not mean that those nations stopped existing. And then she says, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she shall be converted. And a period of peace will be granted to the world. So again, all this is quite tricky. It's tricky to figure out where we are in this apparition. Because officially, as far as we know, Russia has now been consecrated. And she says, in the end, the Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me. So maybe that is what he did in 1984. And if that has happened, that means we are to expect a period of peace. Has the period of peace been since this happened, the Soviet bloc kind of fell? Has that been the period of peace, that the Soviet Union fell? And after this period of peace, we're now going into another period of no peace again because Ukraine has just been invaded. Are we not at the period of peace yet? Maybe, because we don't know what kind of time frame we're talking about here. So maybe the consecration has been done, but the period of peace hasn't come yet. And Russia invading Ukraine is one of those things that shows we're not there at the period of peace yet. It took a long time to do the consecration, and we are not at the period of peace yet. But yeah, that's the things that I kind of often have in my mind. I'm thinking about where are we at. I'm thinking about these nations being annihilated. Has it happened? Of course, I don't want nations to be annihilated, but there's certainly an element in what Mary has said happening. She basically said, if it doesn't happen, if my requests are not heeded, certain things will happen. And one of those things certainly seems to be happening, and that's, well, a few of them even, persecution of the church, but also the errors being spread, the errors of communism being spread throughout the world. So it's clear that her requests were not heeded, at least at first, for many decades, and these things started to happen. Now, maybe because the Holy Father, because John Paul II consecrated Russia, not everything that she said would happen happened. But she also did make the point that even if her requests are not heeded and these things do happen, the Holy Father will still consecrate Russia to me. So she's like saying she knows it's going to happen anyway, eventually. And maybe if it happened sooner, there would have been less problems. But because it didn't, certain things did happen. Maybe not all of them, it's hard to tell. But certainly some of them seem to have. And now again, that question of the period of peace. Have we had it? Are we living in it now? Have we been living in it for the past few decades and now we're coming out of it? Or are we still to expect it? All interesting questions that I don't know the answers to, and I'm sure various people have different opinions on them. But yes, that is basically just what I wanted to briefly discuss today. It's almost like a question I'm putting out to the viewers. What do you think? Where are we at with the Fatima apparitions? Are we in the period of peace? Have we had it? Are we going to have it still, do you think? And what do you think about this message, and how much of it have we already seen, and where are we in that message now? So there we go. I'll put the link in the under the video. Take a look, read that. It's an interesting article from CNA. They kind of go through a lot of letters that were sent over the past decades. So have a read of that. And thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.